Like now, today we have two people watching at home. All right, today we're going to talk about website accessibility. And it's a very important topic, and it's a topic that I don't think gets enough attention among web designers, web developers, but it's something that's very critical. One thing to keep in mind, sort of as a precursor to this topic, is when we say www, we're talking about what the World Wide Web. And that implies inclusion for everyone. And that inclusion takes a couple of forms. First of all, it's inclusion for people regardless of platform. So for example, I'm using a Windows machine up here, and I can go and visit different websites using a Windows machine. I have a Mac laptop that I use. I can do the same thing on my laptop. So it's not the Microsoft Wide Web or the Apple Wide Web, it's the World Wide Web. As long as you follow certain rules, and those rules are called protocols, and as long as you have a web browser is a program that allows you to access the web, you should be able to visit web pages and get them to be functional. What does this mean for us as a web developer? Well, it means, first of all, that it's best if we test our web pages on a variety of platforms. So, on this machine right now, we have at least 3 browsers, maybe even a 4th. Yeah, we do. We have 4 browsers. We have Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer. Ideally, you should have more than one browser on your machine, and you should test your page to make sure it works on the different browsers. What do I mean by that? Well, whatever your page is, we'll pretend we're working on Lorain Community College's page. Here I'm visiting it in Google Chrome. Should be able to copy the address and visit it in another browser. And it should work the same. Notice here, that's what the page looks like in Edge. This is what it looks like in Google Chrome. Pretty much exactly the same. We should also test in the other browsers, Firefox and what's the other one? Oh, Internet Explorer. Yes, there are some people in the world that still use Internet Explorer, and we want to make our web page as accessible to everyone as possible, regardless of the platform that they're using for their browser. And you notice the page looks the same across all browsers, so that's good in this particular case. It gets more than that though, because you want to check your page under different browser widths. In other words, you have a page like this, it looks one way. How does it look when the web page gets narrower? And you notice that Lorain Community College's page does something similar to what we were showing last week with the media queries, where it looks one way when the page is a certain width, looks another way when the page has a narrower width. We can also, in Chrome, do mobile emulation, where we go up to Developers Tools and say, all right, what would this page look like if I was viewing it on a Moto G4? What would it look like if I was viewing it on a Google Pixel 2, and so on? So for that, Lorain Community College's page passes pretty well. In other words, it's usable on different browsers, it's usable at different screen widths, and it seems to be usable on mobile devices. You want to test your page in as many of these possibilities as possible. It's not, and if you were doing this in a production mode, ideally you would have a Mac and a PC to test your pages up against. Okay, so test your pages across different browsers and across different browser widths. That's only a small part, though, of what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. Just as important, or perhaps even more important, is handling the different abilities and disabilities of the people accessing your website. We have different things in buildings to make sure that the building is accessible to people, to different people. For example, let me check this. I'm gonna step away from the microphone for a second. Next time you're on campus, and especially it's true on BU 210, if you look on BU 210, the little sign that says it's BU 210, next to that, there is Braille for BU 210. Now, many of you might not have even noticed that, but it's there. That's what it's called an accommodation. It's an accommodation for people that are visually impaired. So they can't see the sign, but they can touch the sign and read the Braille on it to find out what room this is. All right. It's the law that an organization has to have reasonable accommodations. So you have, for example, in the bathroom, you would have stalls for people that would be possibly in wheelchairs or have some other disability. There's similar accommodations that you can do on your website as well. And the accommodations don't have to be something that are intrusive. And it doesn't have to limit to the content that you have on your site, but it's just accommodations so that people that have different abilities and disabilities can access the content the same way. That little Braille sign up there on the lab, if you weren't looking for it, you might miss it. So it's not as though we do things that get in the way of people that don't have that disability. We do things that help people that have the disability and don't get in the way of other people accessing the room, or in this case, our site, our website. That's what we mean by accessibility. Accommodating people with different abilities and disabilities. Now, the most common kind of disability that affects people accessing the web is vision. So much of the web is visual. All right, so much of the web is visual that you may actually wonder how people that can't see can access the web. Well, they access the web by using special tools, special accommodations on their machine that actually reads the web page to them. And let me see if I can get it going on this machine. See if I can find it first of all. Ease of access. It's part of the settings, maybe? Okay. You can do things like, for example, you can make the text bigger. on your page. This would not necessarily be for someone that's totally blind, but would be someone that just has poor vision. There is using speech instead of talking. And you can see there's other things like using Braille and so on. Window Control Enter allows you to turn it on. So let's try that. Window Control Enter. And did that work? Yes, it did. What it's doing right now is it's narrating the screen to us. Let me turn off the volume. Oh, crap. Trust me, it's because of the audio setup on this particular machine. But as you notice, as the little box goes around the word, that's the screen is actually being read to the person using it. The only reason we can't hear it today is because of the way the audio on this machine is set up. There's no speakers, and I'm not sure where the audio is going to. But as you tab around, it will actually read the different things to us. There are other things that we saw before. There can be magnifiers. There can be color filters. So for example, if you are colorblind, you can set the web page to accommodate for the fact that you're red-green colorblind. All right, or whatever. So when we talk about vision, we're not just talking about total blindness, although that is included. We're also talking about people that have poor vision and people that are colorblind. Now, there's always assistive technology that helps those people to access the site. But there's also things that you can do on the web page. We took a quick look at some of the assistive technology. What are some of the things that you can do on your web page to help people that are blind? Well, one of the most important things to do is to put an alt attribute on any image. So if we go to a web page, let's see, let me think of a web page to visit. Let's visit eBay. I'm going to go and I'm going to use the inspect element feature under development tools. To find that image. Here we go. Here's the image tag. They actually don't have an alt attribute on this image tag, which is a problem, actually. We talked about alt attributes when we were covering images, and we said we did it for accessibility purposes. Let's see if we can find an example. Look up the image alt attribute. All right. In this case, in addition to the source for an image, we specify an alt attribute, girl in jacket. That will at least give the user some idea, if they're blind, what the image is. Now, it's not as good as seeing the image, of course, but people that are blind, it is useful to be able to see a text description of the page, of the image. So the screen narrator will actually read the alt attribute instead of, in addition to displaying the image. There's also a title attribute that if your mouse is hovered over it, it will display. So that's one accommodation that we can have, is we should use alt attributes on all our images. But there are other accommodations we can do as well. Number one is we can make the text on our screen have adequate color contrast. Let's see if we can find a good and a bad example of that. Okay, here are color combinations from hell. Can you imagine this image? This image is hard enough to read even if you do not have any vision issues. But if you imagine if you had red-blue color blindness, this would be almost impossible to read because it would be one shade of gray on top of another. And they give some examples here of things to use and things not to use. There actually exists a filter, because if you're not colorblind, it's hard to imagine what a page would look like for people that are colorblind. But there are actually filters that you can use to emulate that. And here's an example. Here's an image and what is viewed like with people that have normal vision. If you have this particular kind of color blindness, that's what the image looks like. If you have this kind of color blindness, this is what it looks like. This kind of color blindness, and so on. With some of them, you can actually put in the URL of a website. You can do that here. And pick a color blindness filter and fetch and filter it. And it will show you what the page looks like. Some of these take a little while. That's what the page looks like normally. This is what the page looks like if you have that one particular kind of color blindness. And you can change the color blindness filter. This would be if you can see only in grayscale. You can see if you see this only in grayscale, this page would be very difficult to read. This text just blends in with the background because they're both different shades of gray. So you can give people that are colorblind colors that are of adequate contrast. All right. Now, what else can you do for people that are colorblind? Well, if you use color to indicate something, you can also indicate something using a different method as well. For example, if you have very important text that you want the user to read, if you have a warning message, for example, and you decide I'm going to make a warning red, all right? So the text for a warning appears in red text. That's fine and good for people that can see red, but for people that cannot see red, that's not going to get the message across that this is a special warning. So what you could do is you could put it in italics as well. You could put it bold. You could make it in a slightly bigger font. So never just use color to indicate something. Use color along with something else to indicate something. Obviously, don't have too small a text, although the text can be resized by magnifying the window, so you can kind of get around that problem if you have the issues. All right. Vision is just one issue, though, that people have visiting a website. What are some other disabilities that might affect a person's ability to visit a website? Well, one of them is hearing loss. And again, this could either be being completely deaf or hard of hearing, or just in a situation where it's difficult to hear. If you're in a noisy place, if you're on a machine that doesn't have speakers, and you didn't bring your headphones with you, or whatever. What you can do is you can provide any content that you provide that's audio, you can provide a transcript. All right. So if you had an interview with someone, you could provide a transcript of that interview so that people that can't hear it could follow along with the transcript. All right. If you have any video that includes audio, you could make the video be closed captioned so that the person that is viewing the video can read the captions. Now, there's a lot of software that does that for you automatically. In fact, for the videos that I create, a caption is automatically generated. Unfortunately, that caption isn't always accurate. So as a developer of a website, you ought to go in and edit the caption to make sure it really reflects what you said. But just because of the way different people sound different, it might take a word and make it to another word that sounds similar to it that actually destroys the meaning of it. All right. YouTube has a caption facility, and sometimes if you read it, it's really inaccurate. But you can take that and refine that and edit it and make it more useful. What are other things that affect the people's ability to access information on a web page? One of them is motor control. What do I mean by that? I mean the ability to move your hands and move the mouse. Well, what can we do about that? We can do a couple things. Number one, we can make sure that there's adequate space between links so the person doesn't have to struggle to get on a very small link area. We can also make it so that the links, in addition to being not closely spaced, we can make sure that the links are big enough. So again, so that the user can more easily find their way on top of them so that they can click on them. The other thing that we can do is we can use keyboard shortcuts. This is definitely relevant for people that are blind as well, because people that are blind can't move a mouse, right? They can't find the place on the screen to select the mouse text. So let's look for an example of this. Here are the basic keyboard shortcuts, and many experienced users use keyboard shortcuts all the time simply because it's quicker for them to type it than to manipulate the mouse. And so there's ways that you can do that. You can also put it in to your own code. Typically, you use the tab to interact with one thing at a time. Notice as I'm moving around, it's taking me to each section. Enter allows us to select a link and so on. Shift allows us to reverse the direction. In this case, they make it so that the S does something. In this case, they make it so the Control S does something. This case uses JavaScript, but it doesn't have to be using JavaScript. You can do it just in plain old HTML. Look, I'm looking for a nice little tutorial, but unfortunately there isn't one, at least one that's not popping up. I mean, I'm sure there is one. Again, this uses JavaScript to do it. You can do it without JavaScript as well to like make a page go to a specific link. Another one are people with different cognitive issues. Issues like ADHD or issues like dyslexia that is very hard to understand. What can we do to help these people? We can make the code, or we can make the content on our web pages very clear, not overly cluttered. If we provide a website that has so much information on it, someone with ADHD is going to have a hard time focusing on it. But you know what? So is everyone else is going to access the web page. There's an example that is often cited, and that is Ling's cars. And this person is making the argument that is actually a good idea, but I would disagree with that. All right. This is what the homepage looks like. And if you look for cars or vans, let's look for full price list. There's just so much going on here. It's so cluttered that this definitely would be detrimental to someone that has ADHD. And the close proximity of all the text to each other would make it difficult for someone that has dyslexia as well. Because people with dyslexia, putting adequate spacing between words and between text and all that is useful in helping them sort of understand that. We can sort of boil down all these accessibility rules to a couple. Let me think. Are there any other conditions? I guess there's one that's sort of called age-related conditions. And that is a little bit of all of the above. All right. As you get older, you might not be blind, but your vision might be compromised. As you get older, you might not be deaf, but your hearing might be compromised. You might not have a severe motor control issue like someone that has cerebral palsy or some sort of malady like that, but with arthritis, it's difficult to navigate your mouse around as easily as maybe a younger person would do. And finally, you might not have cognitive issues, but you know, you could have issues of focus on the stuff on a web page. Now, here's something that's really cool. There's a technique or a notion known as universal design. And the principle of universal design says this, that if we make something that's really well designed, it will work both for people with disabilities and without disabilities. So the accommodations we put on our pages are either going to help people are going to help people with disabilities and will either help people without disabilities or will be neutral. an example of a neutral accommodation in a physical building would be the braille that's outside the classroom, right? Many of you, when you came in, you probably didn't even notice there was braille that indicated the room number, but there is. So that was an accommodation. It doesn't really get in your way. All right. You know, you walked right past it, and it's not as though it interfered with people that have good vision. All right. But it's there and it's useful for people that have poor vision or are blind. Or it might even help people that don't have the disability. All right. For example, keyboard shortcuts. Many people prefer to use, especially many experienced users, prefer to use keyboard shortcuts as opposed to clicking on links. So if you put keyboard shortcuts on your page for people that have motor control issues, guess what? You're also benefiting experienced users that like to use keyboard shortcuts. So that's the idea of universal design, that what you do for accessibility either helps people that are not disabled, or at the very worst is neutral, is ignored by people that don't have the disability. An example of that would be the alt attribute. All right. We can have images on our page that have alt attributes. And guess what? People that are not visually impaired will never see or hear those alt attributes. All right. It's only for people accessing the page via a screen reader that they will hear those. All right. So if you're going to come up with a list of things to follow that I would say are universal design, they're going to involve, first of all, following just basic good web design. We put the word good in here. That means making sure it's not cluttered. All right. If you make your web page cluttered, you're going to help people that have ADHD. All right. But guess what? You're going to help everyone else too. All right. Because no one likes to look at a page that is very cluttered with stuff on it, where you can see a million things on a page all at once. It's much better if things are organized in such a way that you're presented with a few things at a time and you can really focus on them. Remember, the more stuff you have on a page, the easier it is to distract you from the stuff that's really important. All right. So if you have 10 things on a page and 2 of them are the most important, well, then those other 8 might distract the user from the 2 that are important. If you only have 2 things on a page, the user automatically is going to focus on those 2 things. All right. So making sure your page is not cluttered. That helps both people with certain cognitive abilities or disabilities, as well as people that do not have those. All right. Providing user choice. Is something that's good. What do I mean by user choice? I mean the ability to pick the font or pick the color scheme. There's a video that allows people that do that, along with a little demo. All right. They have the simple web page that is black and white. But you can pick the color for the background and the color for the text. Now that's sort of nice for everyone. You could customize the website to look the way you want it to. If I'm not mistaken, Canvas gives you some flexibility in that regard, I think. I've never used it, but I think it does. So it's nice for even people that aren't colorblind to be able to pick the color scheme that they want. But for people that are colorblind, that can be especially important because they can pick the colors that work for them. Or, and I'll put another way, they can avoid the color schemes that don't work for them. I don't think that's what I thought it was. But giving the users the ability to customize their page or choice is an effective tool. All right. Who doesn't like the ability to choose that? And for people with certain accessibility issues, that can be beneficial. A person with certain forms of dyslexia can actually pick a font that works better for them. All right. And that can be very useful. There actually is something I saw before, which is interesting if you do not have dyslexia and you want to see what it's like. There's a Dyslexia Simulator. And a lot of people think of dyslexia as you just switch the letters of the words. That's only a small part of it. It's a lot more involved than that. All right, I Googled Dyslexia Simulator, and this will show you this paragraph with how it might look for someone that has dyslexia and how difficult it is to read. Contrary to popular belief, not every person with dyslexia will reverse letters while reading and writing. In fact, such, I don't know what that word is, are very common while, I don't know what that word is, both those with dyslexia and those without are first learning to write. After 2 years of something, handwriting, something, it's very difficult to view things and read if you have dyslexia. What are some things that can help though? Number one, allow the user to choose the font. First of all, don't pick any fancy, elaborate font. All right. The simpler, more straightforward fonts are easier to read. You can Google fonts for dyslexia, fonts to help with dyslexia. And it gives you some guidelines as far as this goes. Sans serif fonts may be less crowded. There's a research paper on it. Another thing that helps with people that are disabled and people that are not disabled is to keep your website simple. For example, avoid flashing animations those can actually trigger seizures in some cases. All right. So you want to avoid those and only have animations if they're really necessary for your page. All right. If, for example, you're showing how a process works, showing how steel is made, for example, you might want to have a animation that shows the process. But it's there for a purpose. It's not there just to make your page look fancy or to decorate your page. All right. And even then, I would specify an alternative. All right. So we're going to start out with a simple, not cluttered web design. And what we're going to add to it, we're going to add to it alternatives. So alt text on images, a transcript for audio, we're going to use color and other ways to show meaning of text. We're going to provide keyboard shortcuts. To allow someone the ability to click on something or to use their keyboard shortcut to access a link, for example. We keep these two principles in mind. Keep it simple and provide alternatives. That really will get you a long way as far as developing a accessible website. Now, there are checklists. By the organizations that deal with these things. Oh, you have to download it from this organization. All right, here's a good checklist. Content is the most important part of your site. Do you use plain language and avoid figures of speech? Make sure that you have button, link, and label element is unique and descriptive. On your links, you shouldn't have a web page that has link 1, link 2, link 3, link 4, because that doesn't tell the user anything. If you would have your first link say, link to ESPN.com, your second link say, link to clevelandbrowns.com, and so on. That would tell the user exactly what that link is. Labels we haven't talked about yet, and buttons we haven't talked about yet. But when you do those, make sure that the text is descriptive for them too. Use left-aligned text for left to right languages and right-aligned text for right to left languages. Validate your HTML. You can actually run your code through validation, and you can pick a website, or you can put your own code in here by keying it in there. And you can run an accessibility check. And it will tell you the different issues that exist with it. has this error, has a warning, has another error, and so on. An image must have an alt attribute, and so on down the line. Warnings are things that you should correct. Errors are things that, or warnings are things that you probably should correct. Errors are things that you should definitely correct. Well, you can run and validate your web page through this, and that's a good idea. That will help your page work regardless of the browser. Make sure you use a lang attribute. Provide a unique title for each page, and so on. Make sure all images have an alt attributes. Make sure, except for decorative images, in other words, images that don't do any purpose but to decorate your page, use a null alt attribute. Provide a text alternative for complex images such as charts. So if I had a graph, in other words, I might have a link that you could click on to actually see all the data behind the graph, so that if someone couldn't see the graph, they could have the chart read to them. And the rest goes down the line for that. I think you can see all of these sort of fit into the idea of keeping it simple and providing alternatives. Provide alternative. Make sure the alt description, that's an alternative, and so on down the line. Are there questions over any of this? Your job, I think, for this week, or maybe for next week, is to create a web page that talks about web accessibility, as well as talks about mobile, design for mobile web pages. Questions on any of those? All right. We will see you next week then.